Welcome back to the Indian Wisdom Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Raj Balkaran. Today, I'm cross posting a very special interview. This interview was actually my 400th New Books Network interview, not counting all the Indian Wisdom podcasts and a couple of podcasts that I've done before this. But for that network, this is certainly a milestone. And for this milestone, I had invited Dr. Wendy Doniger on to speak. She's now recently retired from the University of Chicago, where she held a prestigious chair for over 5 decades and has produced voluminously. She has written dozens and dozens of books. She has produced scores of grad students. Um, I learned so much about the world from interviewing others, from conversation. But this conversation was learning on a different level for me personally. Not so much the content or the insights, the pearls of wisdom. They were great, and they were pearls that I had glanced on some level before, but the extent to which we were both immersed and we were having a living to a educational opportunity. It was a delight to hear more of her intellectual process, her social process, her observations over decades of interpreting Indian myth and contributing to academic output. Of course, there will be areas in which we disagree or in which she might be able to sharpen my thinking or vice versa. And of course, that is the critical enterprise of scholarship and of clarifying ideas. But in all the podcast spaces that I partake in, we came together as individuals, individuals who had mutual respect for one another, and we had I think, epic conversation, at least as far as academic conversations go. Hence, cross posting it here because wisdom arises in the oddest of places. I hope that you enjoy this conversation at least a fraction as much as I enjoyed producing it, engaging it indeed. And also, please reach out to me for podcast suggestions or comments. I'm not hard to find, rajbalkaran.com, or come study with me if you like, indianwisdomschool.com. Without further ado, my conversation with Dr. Wendy Doniger. Welcome back to the New Books in Indian Religions podcast, a podcast channel here on the New Books Network. I'm Dr. Raj Balkaran, your host. More important, I have a very distinguished guest for you today, which happens to be my 400th New Books Network podcast. I'm not sure I quite remember 400 podcasts, but they happen somehow. My guest today is Dr. Wendy Doniger, who is the Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor Emerita of the History of Religions at Chicago. To many of you, she will need a little introduction. To others, I'm sure you've heard her name, even listening to this podcast. She has certainly a distinguished and long-lived career studying Sanskrit texts and just about all things Indic. And it is my pleasure and honor to welcome her to the podcast today. So, Wendy, welcome back to Indian Religions.
I'm very glad to be here. I'm flattered you asked me.
Yeah, our pleasure. So, I love that the book that we're looking at today very much lines up with one of these sort of commemoration episodes. It's typically a conversation with a scholar, because I think the book that you've written is such a fascinating memoir snippet and a conversation in and of itself, perhaps between younger and older selves, perhaps between Western and Indian cultures. And so, of course, for those of you who have clicked on this, have already seen in the podcast notes that we're talking about a new SUNY Press publication called An American Girl in India, Letters and Recollections, 1963 to 64. So prior to diving into some of the content from this publication, could you tell us a bit about the journey of deciding to create this publication? What's the impetus behind this?
Well, when I went to India years ago, 1963 and 64, I had with me a little portable a typewriter, which I took everywhere. And it was my first real trip away from home. I was a rather pampered 23-year-old, and I was very close to my parents. In fact, I wrote a book about my parents right before I wrote this book called The Donigers of Great Neck, which is about who my parents were and how important they were to me. So I was very close to them. And I had this little typewriter, and my way of keeping a diary really was to write these letters. Oh, you're too young to remember. There were these little blue pieces of paper that you folded over and folded over and folded over and sent that way, little air letters. And I typed on one side and on the other side and folded them up and sent them off. And I sent them back to my parents. And then time passed, many things happened. My father died, my mother died, and I inherited a lot of her stuff. And then when I retired from the University of Chicago in 2018, I had a fabulous office, the corner office in the Divinity School, looking out on the quad. And I had lots of junk in it, the way you do when you've had a great office for a long time. And in a box, I found these little blue folded over letters that I had written to my mother, and she had kept them. My mother kept everything. She kept boxes, she kept bottles, she kept all pieces of writing. She had kept all my letters. And in the stuff that came out of her house when we cleaned it out when she died, it must have come to me in a box that I never opened. And I opened it then in 2018, and there were these letters. So I started reading them, and on the one hand, I really liked them. They were full of interesting ideas and observations and thoughts. And I thought, wow, I was pretty smart when I was 23. And then I would come upon these appalling paragraphs which were so naive, so small-minded, so Jewish American princessy, so ignorant of Indian politics. I believed everything anybody told me about Nehru. Everybody hates Nehru, I said at one point. I was with a group of Bengalis who happened to hate Nehru. So on the one hand, there were things I was interested in and I thought might be worth publishing. I am a publisher's daughter. On the other hand, I thought I can't publish these. This stuff was they'll crucify me if my enemies get a hold of this. I'll be the laughing stock. So I gave it to my wonderful Indian publisher, Ravi Singh, who had published the director of Speaking Tiger, who had published my book, The Hindus, when Penguin had turned it down, and had published almost everything I'd written since then, since this is 2012, a long time ago. And I said, he said, these are great. I want to publish them. And I said, yeah, but I want to edit them. I want to take out. He said, no, 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 no. He said, no, leave them that way, but intersperse between the letters comments showing how you've changed your ideas about that. So it became not just a record of what I had thought and learned and seen and experienced during that year, but of how my ideas had changed, how we used to believe. I was not the only one. I was not particularly stupid. A lot of us believed a lot of stupid things in 1963, and how I no longer believe them and so forth. So there's a conversation then between the rather naive 23-year-old who loved everything she saw in India and loved this and that, and the more mature, well, in 2018, how old was I? I was 78, old lady, who had learned a lot since then and would have seen India very differently. The other thing that had changed, besides me growing up and sort of getting a little smarter, was India. That what was really interested in the letters was not me, but what I saw. And the India of 1963, newly freed from the British yoke, turning things out, welcoming strangers, Hindus, Muslims, everyone was just fine together. Um, it was such an open place, such a welcoming place. Alas, so different from the India of today in so many ways, that too was something worth preserving and saying, look how it has changed, though not always in a good way. So those were the two things that I thought made the book worth publishing, and Ravi thought made the book worth publishing. And that's how we did it. We published the letters. I mean, I did cut some things like, would you please send me another pair of socks? I want size 6 instead of, the stuff you write to your mom. So there was a little bit of editing, but I didn't edit the wrong ideas. I kept the intellectual stuff there. I just left, I will be on this flight. They've changed my flight. I left that stuff out. But otherwise, it's as it really came out of that little portable typewriter. So that's the book. That's why I published it, and that's why I'm glad I published it.
So fascinating, such a unique and remarkable enterprise in certain ways, and perhaps owing to a career of staring at piranhas. But I really appreciate the extent to which the work was diachronically produced, but can nevertheless be synchronically appreciated, and the interplay between the two. Also, I'm at a certain age in my mid 40s where it's delightful to once in a while hear, "Oh, you're too young for this," because all too often, for an undergrad, I'm over the hill, right?
Yeah.
For a freshman college student, I'm over the hill, and for others, I'm barely hatched. So fascinating.
Yeah.
What are the sorts of things, and we can even get into specific ideas or vignettes. What what were your reactions like with your older self reading these letters? What are certain observations or moments in these letters that still stand out to you as literally remarkable in terms of what you were thinking, perhaps both in a favorable way and perhaps in a way that you think could use some correction as you sort of describe it?
Well, the good thing that there are many things. I wrote a lot. It was a very rich year. What I was touched by when I read it over the first time was the friendliness and openness of all the people I met and the way I felt so safe. I remember I was in Calcutta. I was driving around all over places. I took a taxi cab with two great big Sikhs in the front seat, going into some suburb of Calcutta in the far distant where there were no lights on the streets. And I thought, I wouldn't do that today. And I was okay. They were fine. They were perfect gentlemen and all of that. People invited me into their houses. Um, the bus broke down at one point on some trip I took, and the bus driver invited me into his home with his wife and his children to have dinner with him while they got another bus to come and take the place. Sort of the openness of moving among people of all different kinds, Hindus and Muslims and Indians and British people, and I met some French guys and so forth, that there was a kind of safety, a feeling of safety. You didn't worry that someone was going to get you, of generosity. Please come to our house, share our food. It was quite extraordinary. For me, coming from America, I thought it was extraordinary from the world I left. And now looking back on the India that I know now, it also looks extraordinary. It was like a special moment in time in a way, which was superior in its hospitality to either the country I knew or the country I was getting to know. Sorry about that. My watch spoke to me. So that strikes me, the friendliness. Um, and then all these people I met that were just so nice to me. I met Ali Akbar Khan, and he gave me private lessons on playing the charade. I learned how to play the charade. He said, I went to a concert and it was wonderful. I loved him. I think he was always a better musician than Ravi Shankar, but we can talk about that. In any case, and he went with me to buy a charade. He said, "Don't buy that." And of course, the people in the shop said, "Well, Ali Akbar, whichever one you want." Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So he did that. And Sanskrit teachers taught me Sanskrit. People, I learned music. I learned to sing Rabindranath songs. Shantiniketan was a great place for Rabindranath song. People were just generous and open and kind in a way which I never really saw anywhere else either in all my travels. I lived for 10 years in England. I lived for a year in Moscow. I lived most of my life in America. I'd never experienced such hospitality and generosity as I did in India in those years. So that struck me reading the letters that that people were so good to me.
That's beautiful. And I think perhaps this bespeaks some of the marks of the moment that you capture, sort of the historical moment,
Yeah.
and broadly speaking, that you capture. And perhaps you can flesh out. You anticipated a few in your earlier comments, but perhaps you could flesh out with these eyes now. What are the marks of that moment, that historical, cultural juncture that you capture in these letters, or at least your perception there?
Well, I spent a lot of time in Calcutta and Shantiniketan. Bengali Bangla was the only Indian language that I knew. Um, uh, but a lot of people spoke English. We've just come out of the Raj after all. So I had no trouble communicating. I remember I remember reading from my notes, and it's in the book. My friend Chanchal, my Punjabi friend, she was my best friend at Shanti. I met her in the dorm. She immediately became my pal. She didn't think I could eat the food in the dorm. She cooked for me. She defended me in all sorts of ways. She was wonderful. Excuse me. So Chanchal was a Hindu who had lived up in the Punjab at the time of partition and had experienced it and had seen cousins, maybe brothers, killed, and had seen a lot of other people killed, and was enormously anti-Muslim. And this bothered me. I wasn't, and uh, most of the people I knew, as far as I knew, we didn't always discuss this, but she came out with it, and I got some insight into how it is that Chacha was a good person. She was a kind, sort of a motherly, a plump, charming, funny, laughing, cheerful. She wasn't a dour, a hateful person at all. But let me tell you, on the subject of Muslims, and I got some insight into how even a good person, if you do enough bad things to them, can fall prey to that sort of thing. I argued with her. Maybe I made some inroads in it. She never did anything to anybody, but her deep feelings were there, and I learned something about where religious intolerance comes from in a really nice, good person, a good-hearted person. At the same time, she was so funny, and she was so naive in some ways. She'd never seen a Jew. She said, "You can't be Jewish." I said, "Why can't I be Jewish?" "I am." She said, "Well, you don't have a big nose." I said, "Well, not all Jews have big noses, Chantal." So we had these conversations you could never have with a person in the world I came from. And that was eye-opening. I was also um, bewitched by the landscape, which was so beautiful. Bengal in the countryside, monsoon, and after the monsoon. Um, and it brought to life the paintings I'd seen and the poems I'd read, what it was really like to be out, how you really could not go out in the rain in the monsoon or you would drown. That amazed me. It was like being underwater. I'd never seen rain like that before. And I understood things about the poetry of the monsoon and so forth. So all the literature I'd read came to life in that way. And then, of course, I saw the temples. I saw people at worship. I saw Vedic sacrifice. I saw the sacrifice of a goat. I'd read all about sacrifice of goats. I wanted to see one. So my friends took me to the Kali temple in Calcutta, and there we were, and there I am in my anthropology mode, wearing my anthropologist hat. I am seeing a goat sacrifice. And they brought out the goat, and one person held the goat's horns, and another person held the goat's legs, and they stretched in two different directions. So the goat stretched, and a third guy with a sharp scimitar brought it down whack, on the goat's neck, and the head sprung away from the body, and the blood spurted. And I passed out cold on the floor of the temple. And my friends missed the rest of the ceremony. They had to pick me up and drag me out into the fresh air and so forth. So that was when I decided I wasn't gonna be an anthropologist. I wasn't gonna do any more field work. I would just read about the Vedic sacrifices in the Brahmanas and the old Vedic texts. So I sort of found out who I was and had some experiences that were too much for me. But that was the only really negative experience of Hinduism I had, I must say, with that goat sacrifice. Otherwise, I love the temples. I love the ceremonies. I love the Kali Puja in Calcutta. I avoided the slaughter of the goat during the Kali Puja in Calcutta. So these things I read all came to life. The place, Banaras, Varanasi, the sacred city, I actually saw it and saw people going down to the ghats. And um, I saw Ajanta, I saw Ellora. Ellora was the place, I think, still the most impressive place I've ever seen on the planet Earth, where the temple was carved down into the earth. So you went down into it, and it was entirely a temple, as it would any place else. It was all out. It was negative. It was all taken away in order to make the images. So a lot of it came to life, things I'd read about, which remained real to me for years after. It was a key experience in my life.
Yeah, that perfectly preempts the sort of next question that I had in mind. First, I have to muse that we owe it to the grace of this fateful goat sacrifice that you've spent so much of your time and energy interpreting Sanskrit text.
Absolutely. Give me a text. Leave me out of the goat sacrifice.
These eternal Ajah texts. That's great. Um, in many ways, as you've already prefaced it, this trip was formative and for for you as a person, but also clearly for you as a scholar. So, in what ways does this trip plant the seed for subsequent scholarship? And certainly, I think life is such that we don't even see the seed until we've noticed the flowering looking back. And so,
Mm,
if you can comment on your trajectory as a scholar.
it's true. It's interesting. Um, Seeing how people actually lived, the landscape. It seems to me, it made me realize how important landscape is to religion. The landscape of ancient Israel. When you read the Hebrew Bible, you couldn't have written that book in Norway. It's just the land is part of the way you think of the gods is because of the monsoon, the heat. The Hindu gods are very extreme. They are very hot. They are very cold. Um, and I understood Shiva, who was the god I cared about most, that he is the god of a monsoon climate where there's no water at all, or there's too much water, tremendous heat, and so forth. So I think I understood the religion, some basic deep part of the religion from that. Seeing the temples, seeing how people actually worshipped, made me understand what it was. I would read a Sanskrit text and it would say, and she prayed to Shiva, and I would read what she said. So then I knew what it meant to pray, what she was wearing, how she stood, how she bent down, how she touched her head to the ground, how she made an offering. I understood how people prayed in Hinduism and what that meant. Um, so I had a feeling for the religion, for the physical trappings of the religion and for the emotional pulses behind it as I traveled around India and also just the worship in Calcutta and in Shantiniketan, which is basically worship of Tagore. But through Tagore, you also occasionally also um, they chanted an Upanishadic poem every morning. We got up at dawn. Yo Devagnau, Yo Psu, Yo Vishwam Vanama Viveshu, and so forth and so forth. Um, and just it became, I saw what it was like to chant rather than to read. And that was very, very interesting to me also. So I understood things about the religion, about the ritual, about the way people were to one another, how they acted. Um, what good manners were and bad manners, how you ate, how you didn't eat. I remember I was still an American. So I was a guest at someone's one of the Tagore family, big family, fancy family. The Tagore's very fancy family in Santiniketan. And I was invited to a very fancy family. And I was served, and the food was, of course, very spicy. And I was thirsty, but I wasn't sure about drinking the water. I had been warned by American friends. So I had been given a pill, which I'd never used before. And everybody said, you put it in the water, it'll purify the water. So it's a shame this is not television, it's just radio. So I took my hand and I had the pill in it in a closed fist. And I was sitting casually talking, leaning my head on my other hand, and I extended my hand with the pill in it very gracefully as I was talking. And I sort of went to pick up the glass and I dropped the pill into the glass as I did. And it was a glass made of glass, and it turned the water crimson. It was a chlorine pill. And I was too stupid to know that chlorine is a very powerful dye, among other things. And everyone in the room knew that I hadn't trusted my hostess's water. And this is 50, 60 years later. How long is it? 60, 70 years later. 60 years later. 60 years later, I still feel ashamed and embarrassed when I recall that moment. That was the worst thing I did in India. Worst thing I did in my life anywhere. Dropping a chlorine pill into an aristocratic dinner. As- I didn't do that again, and I didn't make other mistakes of that sort. Um, I met Jomini Roy, the painter, and I bought several paintings from him that I still have hanging in my house, and talked with him about his work and how he painted. People just let me come and talk to them. It was so open and so welcoming. Mm.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Regarding your comment about this being radio, not television, what we'll have to do at some point, some places we'll have to publish the actual video so folks could see your hand gestures as well. Um,
As I
um,
drop the chlorine pill.
right, of course, and it's so intriguing that both of these formative stories involve streaks of red liquid.
Blood or chlorine, yes.
um,
Yeah.
Yeah, so what really comes to mind when you reflect on the particular impact of this trip between the climate and the sacred geography and the gestures and the incantation versus reading is really this theme of embodiment. Really
Mhm.
feels like you being there in an embodied sense really impressed upon you the embodied elements of religiosity. And it is often dawned on me when I think that obviously there are scholars of various stripes, and it takes a particular skill set to appreciate story, sort of, and then interpret story intellectually. And one of the features of your scholarship that really come out in living color for me is that I realize that this textual scholar really knows people. They have a grasp not just on text, but on lived impulses. Now, we can agree to disagree, obviously, in various critical venues regarding lenses and all that. And that's not the space for that here. But it seems to me that you really have a knack for people. And whether that's by virtue of this trip, whether it's congenital, whether it is by virtue of a life, an examined life that you're living, and perhaps you can comment on that element of your process and your scholarship.
Well, it's a flattering, um, and I hope not inaccurate observation. What I really have written about is stories. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not much of a historian. What I really did was find a lot of stories that people had ignored because I started with the Puranas, which were considered beneath contempt. You're supposed to be reading kavya or grammar or philosophy. So I've always went for the stories, and by getting to know how people are, I never assumed, as for instance, Richard Burton did when he translated the Arabian Nights, that these people were different from us, different ideas of fear and power and passion and so forth. So I always assumed, because I knew these people in India, that after you got over the, all Jews have big noses and other things like that, that they felt the way I felt about stuff. Um, what is it that Shylock says in defense of the Jews in Merchant of Venice? If you cut us, don't we bleed? We're like you. So that when I went to translate the stories from the Sanskrit text, I assumed that given the cultural differences, which I had learned both by reading and by living in India, giving that if you cut me, I will bleed. That jealousy, envy, hope, fear, that the people in the stories would experience things much as I would, given this cultural superficial, I thought, overlay that if you ignore people and treat them badly, they cry or they become jealous. So I had a feeling in translating the Indian stories that they were about people whose emotions I could dare to try to understand. That a woman who was jealous when her husband took a second wife in India, even though you are allowed to have lots of wives, that she would feel not unlike the way a woman would feel when she was in love with a man who was sleeping with another woman in any world. That there was a kind of a human base. So obviously, she wouldn't do anything about it the way a married woman would if her husband took a mistress. It was okay, it was legal. But I could read, even when I was translating the Kama Sutra, if you read it carefully, they didn't like it. People don't like it. People are people. People are jealous. Um, so I had that feeling from getting to know a lot of different kinds of people in India that given the meaningful cultural overlays that they were people. And when I went back to reading the stories, I had the confidence to translate them and eventually then to write cross-cultural studies like The Woman Who Pretended to Be Who She Was, which was one of my later books. And all my books have Indian stories in them, but the later ones don't only have Indian stories. And there were some very basic Indian stories in which wonderful plays that I translated later on for the Clay Sanskrit series, two great plays, wonderful plays by Bana, about a woman who pretended to be pretended to be who she was in various ways, pretended to be another woman, pretending to be her. And it happens in Shakespeare too. And I wasn't surprised that there's a Shakespeare story with a plot similar to the plot that Bana wrote in what, 9th century India. Um, so that experience in India gave me the confidence to assume that in addition to, and given the difference that culture does make, which I never denied, there's another layer always of shared humanity, which made me bold to believe that I could understand how an Indian woman felt in the 5th century when her husband took a second wife, even though in that culture it was quite different from having a mistress in Europe. So that was part of that. Excuse me. So that was part of that building of confidence that I could get inside the heads of the characters in stories written long ago and far away that I'd spent most of my life studying. It was being there.
Yeah, to my mind, to my own particular view, that's deeply resonant insofar as I think that, there is a lot of great scholarship that understands to a refined degree the distinctiveness of a cultural,
Oh,
historical,
yeah.
sociocultural horizon. There's no question about that. But I think that what is particularly brilliant in humanities scholarship is keeping that in mind, viewing that through one eye, and through the other eye, viewing what makes us human, the
Mm-hmm.
impulses that we can perhaps deduce, intuit, or observe that probably have been fairly elemental for at least 100,000 years in the history of Homo sapiens, if not before that. And then there's something of the quote unquote the generalities and the impulses of the human heart that allow you to connect. I happen to be spoiled to live in the world's most diverse city, Toronto. Statistically, I think 55% of the city is literally from 150 different nations. We don't know why this is the case, but this is the case, and there's so
You're going to
much.
get a lot more Americans soon if things go on the way they are now.
Not to worry, we won't build a wall. As far as I know, you're okay. At the southern border, but it is there are obviously there's so much to be learned about various cultures and well, clearly, and yet there's so much shared humanity that when you're open, you can have a meaningful, touching conversation with anyone. And what you said earlier about an assumption, see, I don't get the sense from your presence and your scholarship that it's precisely an assumption. I think it seems to be an observation or intuition or something that you're discerning, that there is something of the quote unquote the human experience. Of course, we have to problematize and color that and understand the cultural horizon. I mean, it's crucial. You know, I had the good fortune of giving a talk earlier today. Oh, everything on Zoom for me for the last 5 years. At It was a South Asian institute at the Ukrainian Academy of Arts and Sciences, and it was about the Devi Mahatmya that's now for the first time been translated into Ukrainian by a student of mine. And how I started is look at first glance, this is a very, very different text. It's Sanskrit, it's a different time, it's a different space, it's a different culture. But hey, if you're interested in a story about power and the machinations of power, the restoration of power, might you be interested in this, oh ye Ukrainians? Then maybe this text has something to say to you. And I think it's kind of these are for myself. I would love for you to comment on this because you've had obviously much experience and you have a different perspective, I'm sure. But these impulses almost seem to be functioning in different directions, and that one is seeking particularity and the other is holistic. Perhaps one is more right or left brain. We can argue about the neurophysiology, but I would love for you to comment on whether you see that as a tension, or do you focus on one over the other, or how would you characterize that dance?
Yes, I think the basic assumption has to be of a sameness. In other words, I gave the example of a man who's married and who takes a second wife or a mistress. So the first thing in order to make that statement at all is the statement, which I'm prepared to back up with evidence, that all over the world there are men who, having engaged in marriage, do sometimes take another woman. This is a fact I think I can back up with enormous amounts of evidence. So that's your sameness. Then the difference is what is allowed, how is it justified, and what does the woman feel, what does the man feel, what do you do about it? And that's where there's an enormous difference. If it's a very strict religious community, the man is violating a very, very important law. He can be prosecuted for it or killed or whatever it is in some communities. His wife has a right to feel that a terrible crime has been committed, as well as an insult to her sexual ego and everything. And in some places, it's just the way everybody does it. It's allowed. You do it. You have your wife, and then you have these other women. And so you have an enormous, in order to make the comparison at all, you have to say there's some kind of assumption that the primary pair is special in some way, legally, emotionally, whatever it is, but that different cultures will deal differently with the violation of that primacy. So you have to have them both. You have to say there are human beings. There are some cultures in which nobody gets married at all. Everybody just sleeps around and so forth. There are many cultures, however, in which there is a basic pair. You can also, if you want to, as I often do, go to animals and note that some animals mate for life. Many, actually, species of animal mate for life, and others do not. So there's a variety there. It can and can be. And without that initial assumption of likeness, you can't do the comparison. You can say, well, in Islamic nations, the consequences for the man are not bad at all. and the women don't seem to mind it as much as they do, and so forth. So you have to have them both. You have to have some basic ideas of what every human being, that's the Shylock argument. If you cut us, do we bleed? And if you hurt us, will we not, will we not get mad at you? And otherwise, you can't do your work at all. You might as well just say, here's India, this is what Indians did. Isn't it interesting? Goodbye. And that's not fun for anybody. It's always worthwhile translating a Sanskrit text. There is also always worthwhile doing an anthropological study of a village. So I don't mean in any way to belittle the work of unique cultural studies, but the work I do is different. And I want to defend it by saying it depends upon that work of unique cultural studies to begin with, but then it can do something else that the mere textualist or the anthropologist who does nothing but record what she sees in the field can't do, and that's worth doing. And that's the work of the comparatist or the historian of religions or whatever you want to call it. In addition, I want to say that I think comparison is a basic and universal and unavoidable human characteristic. You do this. Funny, I do that. You like to put salt on your food. Funny, I like to put sugar on my food. I just think we're always noticing ways in which within our own culture we are and are unlike. One of the daughters talks a lot, the other one doesn't talk so much. This comparison is always there within a culture, and I don't see any reason why it shouldn't be there between cultures. It's a basic human way of making sense of the world. There was a time when it went out of fashion in the study of religion. I wrote a book called The Implied Spider, defending it and so forth, and talking about context. And in the second edition, I backed up a little bit, and the publisher, Columbia University Press, very nicely allowed me to make some significant changes in the theoretical part of that book, acknowledging that you cannot really study another culture without noting the difference in context. You can't just take the story and set it against another story, and I didn't do it actually in my own work either. So that was a way I changed my mind about about ways, the limits of comparison. You can't just say, oh, the women in this country don't mind when their husbands have other wives, and the women in this country do. You have to say more. What's the country like? What are the wives like? What is the situation? You've got to do your homework. You can't just make broad comparative swipes the way my mentor Eliada often did. So I backed down on that to a certain extent, but I still feel that the two tasks are both important and they need one another.
Yeah, I personally couldn't agree more, and that's why it's a little bit dizzying because one eye has to be cognizant of the distinctions and what's disparate. And yet I do believe if you do that well and you respect the for example, just in one particular case, the sociocultural context or what we can know about the Devi Mata, and respecting that and being cognizant of that, you can nevertheless view the text as a potentially cross-cultural meditation and reflection and personification of power and the machinations thereof. And I think that's where the brilliance really shines when those are done in tandem. So many interesting threads. But I love what you say about the trajectory of you changing your thinking or sort of enriching your thinking. And certainly, isn't that why we're here to learn? And if only we knew then what we know now, but then we wouldn't have, what's the point of all the experiences if we don't learn anything from them? And so could you maybe, is that some of the advice? What advice, what advice might you give that young woman writing those letters? What may you want to say to her from this perspective?
I would say, from the perspective of the other half century, um, that one of the reasons that I had such fun in my work, and to a certain extent such success with the teaching and the writing, was that I wasn't afraid to take a chance and make a mistake. That I've seen many good scholars crumble and leave the profession because they're afraid that the book they're working on hasn't quite got it exactly right. That if they worked on it a little more, they could refine it better. That if they had a little more data, they could build up their hypotheses better, or if they thought it through a little more, if they read a little more, something like that. Um, the better is the enemy of the good. So I wasn't like that. I gave it my best shot, and I knew that I had not said everything that could be said on the subject, but I'd said something worth saying about it, and I wanted to get on to the next thing. And so I published the book. And years later, mostly I don't read my old books. I don't read anything now anymore. But in the old days, I would sometimes, someone would force me to, and I'd say, "Oh, did I say that? I don't think that now." Um, but it was worth saying. Other people found it interesting, if only to disagree with it. Sometimes someone who read it felt she's on the right track, but she hasn't quite got it. Then they went forward and they did better what I had sketched out and not properly finished. So I feel that scholarship is a process of growth, and that you grow from by writing a book, you learn something, and by writing a book, you also learn what you don't know. And then you say, I need to write another book about that. I used to think of writing books like yogurt. So you make yogurt. When you finish the yogurt, you have a little piece left over, and you get a platter, a bowl of warm milk, and you put the leftover yogurt into that, and you make the new yogurt with it. So whenever I finished a book, what is to say, I felt I'd said all that I really could say, or just the publisher said, "Come on, let's have it." There was always something that I felt I hadn't quite solved, or if I'd only had another text there, I let it go. I published the book, but I had that extra thing in my head. I never did have a chance to talk about that, and that was the basis of the new book. And so I kind of chain smoked them. I lit each book out of the still glowing embers, that is to say, the still unanswered questions of the last one. And that way I wrote a lot of books and I had a lot of fun and I got promoted to full professor and I lived happily ever after. Um, so I tried to encourage in my students that same feeling that you don't they don't shoot you. They don't stand you up against a wall and shoot you in the head if you publish a book with something that turns out to have been speculative and you didn't get it right.
Yeah.
That scholarship is a process of inquiry and it's never really finished. You do the best you can. You say something no one has ever said. You find a text no one else has discussed. You contribute something to the world and you do the best. And then you go on and later on someone says, there's another text she could have used that would have made that point even better. And that's fine. That's the conversation that scholarship has. And I tried to inculcate that feeling in my students, and the best of them did indeed publish quite a lot. And David Shulman published 10 times as much as I ever did. Arsha Sattar has published more than I ever did. That feeling of it's okay to make mistakes as long as you get something right. As long as you get a lot of it right, you're allowed to make a mistake. Um, and so there are a lot of open ends in a lot of my books, things which I would do differently now, or I would have done differently then, but I'm not sorry I wrote them. They all said something that was of interest to someone, and on you go.
Yeah, that is very, very deeply resonant, both as sort of, I think, a characterization of both your process and the legacy of books that you've left behind. Also, it strikes me as wise to be enjoying the process rather than the endless seeking of a goal, the asymptote that you'll never reach. And so just enjoy the gliding towards it. And, you know, it, I've said a couple of times on this podcast and in conversation something that I perceive about my own work. Firstly, I really like the idea of, okay, well, my PhD and my first book was like, why is Devi Mahatmya framed in this way? What's up with this king and this merchant? And then there's a book. Okay, why is in the Markandeya Purana? What's going on here? And there was another book. This current book that may or may not come out as soon as my translation of the Devi Mahatmya gets off my desk, it's been sitting there for 2 years, is about, well, why does the Markandeya Purana talk to the Mahabharata? Why are they, what's the intertextual relationship there? So I like this idea of building. I love the idea of thinking aloud. And I said, I think on the podcast that, look, some scholars, a lot of scholars, they live to embroider and they take a great deal of pride in the precision and the beauty of their embroidery. I sort of live to generate fabric. Not that the fabric isn't quality fabric. My work's not perfect. I'm the first to admit that, and sure, critique away. And I think,
Nobody's perfect. Not even
you know,
Plato was perfect. Nobody's.
no, but as you say, that they won't shoot you. There may be the odd scholar who takes a swipe at you because they're focusing on the obvious errors without paying attention to it's not perfect, but it's not nothing. There's something substantive there that is of use to someone, if not for you. And so I love that idea because it's I came I came to peace with my own brand of scholarship that is I have creative ideas about the interpretation of stories and how to interpret them in intertextuality, and if others can distill or embroider or focus these ideas, oh, wonderful. But I have to say, on a personal note, it's actually very reassuring to hear that from someone who has been down that road and successfully so. So I think it's just very important for our colleagues and aspiring colleagues to not feel like I would succumb to perfectionism paralysis. And then I'd be like, you know what? I'm going to aim for the B plus. It's probably going to be an A. I'm just going to aim to get this off my desk. Otherwise, I'll be obsessing to make it perfect forever. And I love the strategy of thinking aloud and this understanding that we're all part of this banyan and we all have a role to play. I think that's a beautiful attitude towards scholarship.
Not something someone else finishes it. When I was in school, we used to give exams and all sorts of things, history. And there were two different ways of grading the exam. Either you got a point for every answer you got right, or you got a point for every question you got right, and you were deducted a point for every answer you got wrong. And you needed to know how they were going to grade the test because it would encourage you to make, I wouldn't say wild guesses, but things you weren't sure of. They would encourage you to make guesses. And I have always felt that life was the first kind of a test, that you get credit for everything you get right. And in the long run, it doesn't really matter what you get wrong. If you get something right, you contribute something to what other people can know and enjoy. And if you miss them, you miss that one. Next time somebody else will fix it, so forth. Another American expression is swinging at everything that comes across the plate. And I think that's the kind of a personality I had, that I tried to do the best I could. And where I couldn't get it, I just couldn't get it. There were questions. I also was a student of my great colleague, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist. And the most important thing he taught me, of the many things he taught me, was really the definition of what a myth was. Never mind talking about scholarship, what a myth was. Why there were so many myths about the same thing. Three synoptic gospels, just this is supposed to be a canon of Christianity, and there's three very different ways of telling what happened to Jesus. So even in canonical studies where every word matters, you have spectacular variant. And in something like Hinduism, where there's no pope, you have a whole lot. And Levi-Strauss said it was simply because what the great myths are stories that ask questions to which there is no answer. And so they keep trying and trying again to fit the square peg into the round hole, and it never does fit into the round hole. So the stories themselves that interest me, the big stories, religious stories, human stories, are basically important because they're asking questions to which there is no answer. And therefore, it's all the more appropriate that the scholarship that deals with them also asks questions that you can't always answer. You do the best you can, and at the end, you've got some questions. I don't really know why this text says this at this point. I think I understand this text quite well. I've studied it well. I think I understand the Sanskrit. I think I understand what it says, but I'll tell you it means this, it means that, it means this, it means that, but I don't know why it says this. And you're not surprised because they're dealing with human questions which are always messy. They don't all tie into knots. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. There's a piece left out. Inconsistencies in the Hebrew Bible. I've just been reading the book of Genesis for another project, and there are spectacular inconsistencies in this book that the rabbi's been working on for centuries, for millennia. And it's still on one page it says this, and the Gospels too. This, because it's a story that can't be told. And in a way, I think scholarship is also a story that can't be told. Important scholarship. You do the best you can, you get as much as you can. In the end, there are things that just don't tie up. I don't know why this text says this. Or even in some cases, I'm not sure that I actually understand this sentence in this text. But I understand the rest of it, and I can tell you a lot about it that's worth knowing, but I can't tell you everything. And you acknowledge your imperfection, and you still say, I can do something that other people haven't done. I'll help you along. I have something I can contribute, something unique. I've seen something worth seeing in this text. So that's another way to come to terms with your own inadequacy and not to wait until you've got every single tie tied before you hand the book over to the publisher. For one thing, you want to get on to another book.
Yeah, that's brilliant advice and a very resonant perspective insofar as, well, first I have to muse because just against all odds, I too have been staring at the book of Genesis for the last few months. I'm doing a comparison of the cosmologies of the
A
Devi
mess. The
Mahatmya.
book of Genesis is one big mess.
It is. It's a deeply inspiring and in a very sort of consciously crafted mess, but a mess nonetheless, and it's brilliant. But I've been comparing it to the Devi Mahatmya for an article that I've just submitted. Um, what strikes me about your approach is that it's not reckless, but it's embracing calculated risk, and that's so fulfilling because risk is there's no fulfillment without risk, and to have either the humility or the confidence, the self assurance, or both, or the trust that there are things that I don't see and didn't say, but there are things that I did see and I want to share with others. One of my there's a couple of very sort of odd, obscure side interests that I have intellectually that aren't related to my scholarship at all. And one of them, if you can believe it, I'm not even sure I've shared this on the podcast, is physics. Actually, I'm keeping up with physics for a number of years for a variety of reasons.
I was planning to be a physics major when I
Oh,
went to,
come on.
and then I decided to do Sanskrit instead.
Well, either way, you're looking at the greatest questions ever crafted. And so, one of the reasons why Einstein made so many mistakes is because he made so many attempts and he got so much right in that process. And for the sensible folk, the stuff he got right will by far eclipse the stuff that he didn't quite get right
Yeah.
because he was thinking aloud and grappling. He was developing his ideas in public, which I think takes great
Things that
courage.
you get right are the things that other people can use.
Right.
Things that you get wrong, they don't use. That's okay.
Exactly. And if they can improve it, great. Even better. The other thing that you mentioned in passing that I think is really resonant is this idea of myth and mythology. What is it? And I often think of it as the stories pertaining to the greatest questions, the largest questions, the most meaningful questions. And really, mythological stories are sort of where they point to the mystery, right? They point to what we can't fully know in a conscious sense, like poetry. And their power is in pointing to something that we can't quite cognize fully. And so one has to be comfortable with ambiguity, with multiple perspectives, and ultimately comfortable, I think, with mystery.
Yes, absolutely. The myths themselves are inadequate. they can't get it. They try again and again and again, but they're asking, they have to keep on asking because what they're talking about is so important. Let's try it this way. Well, how about this? Imagine it like this. And different cultures take different assumptions and build in different directions. Um, and some do it better than others. Some books are more fun to read than others. Some are wiser than others, but everybody goes at it in their own way, um, and makes some progress. Just because you don't get it right completely doesn't mean that you don't help. You get some of it right. You have some insight that will help somebody to figure something out. And there's also always the fun of telling a good story. There's everyone likes to read a good story. So you write them, you find them, you translate them, you talk about them, and even if they don't like your analysis, they still read it because they still read the stories. Even if they don't like what you say about the stories, you've done them a favor in giving them the story. So you feel that the book is never a complete washout because there are good stories in it,
it,
that
it,
justify existence.
it'll entertain them one way or another. Do you know it literally took me till the ripe old age of 30 after a degree on the Valmiki Ramayana to realize that what I really loved studying through religious studies at the time was story and narrative. Shouldn't be so surprising because I started an English literature degree, left it to work in the private sector for a while, came back, discovered religious studies and sort of Sanskrit narrative, and so it took me forever to realize that what I loved studying the most was stories. I know it sounds quite obtuse, but you seem
I
to
think
have been
it's the
quite,
most natural thing in the world. I don't see
yeah,
why everybody doesn't study
yeah.
stories.
Oh, I was just about to say, you took the words out of my mouth. It seemed that you knew from quite a young age that you were captivated by stories and
Oh,
ancient Indian stories. So tell us a bit about the onset of that captivation. How and when did you discover that in yourself? And I know there's so much to choose from. Would you maybe say a word about a few of the abiding narratives or narrative vignettes that still very much grip you?
well, I mentioned at the beginning of our talk, um, how much I owed to my parents, and the letters that we discussed were written to them. And my mother gave me some books. I was a smart little girl, and started reading when I was very young. And she gave me some books. She gave me Rumor Garden's books, The River. She gave me The River. I had a translation of the Upanishads by Juan Maspero. It's a terrible translation, I now know, but I didn't know that was the Penguin translation. Um, and I also had Aubrey Menin's version of the Ramayana, which is a satire on the Ramayana. It's a very funny, very naughty book, actually. Um, so I had bits and pieces of Indian stories in my head, even as a child. Um, and I became interested in the ancient world. I studied Latin in high school, and I liked and then I learned a little bit of Greek, and I loved the stories. I didn't read Plato. I read the Iliad and the Odyssey. I was interested in the story literature of ancient Greek, and I had a my high school was a good high school, Great Neck High School. We had a very good Latin teacher, straight out of teachers college. And she knew a good student when she saw it. And she knew how much I liked Latin. And she suggested that she could teach me Greek just privately. She came over once a week for dinner. My mother fed her actually a terrible dinner. My mother was a terrible cook. It's amazing that she stood with it. But anyway, despite the dinner, after dinner, she taught me a little bit of Greek. And I was interested and then she said, if you like, I love the script, the alphas and the betas and so forth. And she said, you'd like Sanskrit. And I said, what is Sanskrit? And she says, the language of India. So I liked old languages, and I knew I liked stories. I knew I liked I used to love the Grimm's fairy tales and so forth. I always loved stories. So at the age of 17, when I went to Radcliffe, otherwise known as Harvard, um, I majored in Sanskrit. I didn't major in physics. Physics got pushed aside. So and when I was in high school, before I went to college, I was the editor of the school newspaper, and I wrote short stories, terrible, terrible stories that were published in the newspaper. But I wrote them in a style that was compounded of the King James Bible and Hemingway. So I wrote stories that went like, and there was a man and he saw a river and he went down to the end of the river and it was just, they're just terrible. But you can see what, what my head was doing at that time. I was already interested in folk narratives rather than great philosophical tracts and in ancient languages. And when I then studied Sanskrit at Harvard, I studied with the great Daniel Ingalls, and he taught me Sanskrit. And then we were reading Kavya, um, uh, court poetry, Sanskrit, very elaborate court poetry. And one of the poems we read was Kalidasa's poem, Kumarasambhava, The Birth of the Prince, which was the story of how Parvati got Shiva to marry her, and they um, produced Kumara, Skanda, the son, the prince. And I liked it. I liked the story. I was okay with the caveat. I thought it was kind of a roundabout way of saying something, a little bit ornate for my taste, but it was a good story. And he happened to mention that there were also these texts called Puranas that told the same stories, but they were in a very bad Sanskrit, really terrible Sanskrit. It was sort of the equivalent of Reader's Digest. It was just, um, so I immediately went to Widener Library at Harvard and found these Puranas, and I loved them. And you could read them. So Kafka was tricky. You had to look up the words and figure them out. The Puranas were just like the bad stuff I was writing in high school. And he went down to the river and he saw a boat and he saw a woman in the boat, basic stuff. I loved it. And Ingalls was appalled. I think of it now as if someone who taught you Mozart discovered that you liked Elvis Presley better. It was a really lowbrow stuff. But that's what I liked. Simple storytelling, lots and lots, and different versions of it. Sometimes there were two people in the boat, sometimes there was one person in the boat, sometimes it wasn't a boat, but it was a flying bird. So I was hooked. Um, so I found my milieu as an undergraduate. Um, I wrote my dissertation, my undergraduate dissertation, my BA dissertation, when I was, what, 20 years old, on the story of Shiva and Parvati, basically Kumara Sambhava, in the Puranas. And no one was doing Puranas at that time except historians, and they're terrible history. They're all inaccurate. Kings all lived 10,000 years. It's just bullshit history. As history, the Puranas are really useless, and these Indian historians were trying to get out of this great chaff of useless mythological shit, bits and pieces of actual history. There was a king who did reign at this time, and we do have some inscription. The little pieces they would pull out of this morass was so people thought very poorly of the Puranas. They were not reliable. They were just bad history. But they were very good folklore, and they were pretty good mythology too. So that was just a lucky thing for me. I was translating these texts that people had ignored and writing about stories that had not been noticed or taken seriously in the study of Indian literature. And there I was, off and running, basically because I am a lowbrow. And I found lowbrow Sanskrit literature, which suited me just. And most people are lowbrows. I'm here to tell you, the world is full of lowbrows, including scholars who are lowbrows. And therefore, people enjoyed the books and bought them, and publishers were happy with me. And I lived happily ever after.
The story about the stories.
Sorry
That's
about this
great.
story.
So you've already sort of preempted this a bit in terms of the original reception of the Puranas and some of the changes that were happening. Do you want to comment in any way, shape, or form about trends in scholarship that you've seen since you were that 22-year-old wide-eyed doctoral student of this publication?
I was lucky to live when I did, um, both because I found these wonderful texts that had been ignored, and also because there weren't so many restrictions on what you could do. People had theories, and they um, you didn't have to do theory when I was beginning. I was an old-fashioned scholar. I was trained as a Sanskritist. I was not trained as a historian of religions. I was trained in a field where you learned the language and translated the texts and wrote about what was in the texts. So not only did I not have to deal with Derrida and all of that at that period, I also didn't have to deal with feminism at that period. And I actually didn't have to deal with sexism either. I was interested in stories about women, and I was a woman, and I just wrote about them. And I didn't have to theorize them. A lot of my early books deal with women and with stories about women and by women. And women, of course, are the great storytellers of ancient India before the male Sanskritists take their stories and fancy them up and publish them. So it was when I was actually a professor that I first encountered those waves of theoretical concern, which might have dimmed my lights had I had to deal with them in the early 60s and early 70s when I was writing. So I was not much of a theoretician. I kind of just read the text and wrote what I thought about them. Then I began to think about theory. I did think about Freud. I did think about Levi-Strauss. Um, I had ideas that came from some of these other thinkers, but I was never much of a theoretician. Mainly Freud and Levi-Strauss gave me ideas of where to look for stories and to some extent what to do with them. I wrote one Freudian book, which was the only book I ever wrote, which was not a success at all, and I loved it. It was a little book based upon the Jaiminiya Brahmana, Tales of Sex and Violence, folklore, sacrifice, and danger in the Jaiminiya Brahmana. The Jaiminiya Brahmana is a small, fairly obscure sacrificial text with a lot of boring stuff in it, but there are a few stories that I fished out, and they're very weird stories. They're about violence and incest and a lot of stuff that Freud was interested in. At that point, I was working a lot with Sudhir Kakar, the great Indian psychoanalyst. The book is dedicated to him. He was a very good friend of mine. Just died a year ago. I still miss. We were friends all his life. Um, so that was a sort of a psychoanalytic book in some ways, and nobody even noticed it. I can't even say it was a failure. I don't think it was reviewed. It sort of just went by the wayside. It was a small book. And it was the only book I ever had that sort of no one seemed to notice. I think it's an interesting book. I think they're really interesting stories, and I had things to say about them, but no. So so I didn't do real well with theory. Then I wrote The Implied Spider about theory, about what theory can and can't do in the study of myth. And I defended basically a very non-theoretical approach. But at the end, I acknowledged that certain theories were central to my work. So that was the time I really talked about it. I just used theories without. I got interested in certain subjects because I'd been reading Freud, but I didn't write about Freud. Didn't read about feminism. I just wrote about women. I felt that women's stories had been neglected and they were very interesting, and I wrote about them. But I didn't have a theoretical stance. I was usually on the side of the women, actually, in the stories that I told. Um, so I wore my theory lightly, if at all. Being at the University of Chicago, everybody was talking about theory all the time. So I was kind of steeped in it, and I knew it was there. But I tried not to get into trouble by being naive about theory. I tried not to make statements that were theoretically too naive or insupportable. I kind of did an end run around theory. I kind of avoided areas where important theoretical work had been done, which I would have to deal with. So I plowed my own furrow in other areas, with the exception of The Implied Spider, which has actually been my best-selling book. So go figure. Go figure.
Well, it's sort of a meta book, right? It's sort of drawing together insights and the vignettes from various works. I think that's perhaps that's why it is doing well. And the other reason I think it's doing so well is I think that we have such an incredibly, left brain civilization. Certainly scholarship lives there and people love analysis and it's very,
Yeah.
very important. But it becomes problematic when it's at the expense of embodied experience or direct observation. And so clearly one is wise if studying a text to understand some, if someone wants to study the Devi Mahatmya, for example, yeah, and I've said this in various ways to students in whether they're undergraduate students or continuing study students. Before you read what Goburn or myself or Doniger or anyone is saying, read the story over and over and over and over again. And by virtue of that, corroborate if you think the scholar has any clue what they're talking about. But the minute you live in the level of analysis, you've already framed the data without even really encountering it. So I think
Shutting out possible insights. The way I got away with, in a way, writing The Implied Spider was I was invited to give the ACLS lectures, Phi Beta Kappa lectures. And the way you give them is that you prepare 3 lectures, and various schools that normally would not be able to pay a good fee, smaller schools for a lecture, they send you there, and you give those lectures, 3 lectures, and you stay for a couple of days, and you give as many as you like. And I'll show you where I am now. So I'm in my house on Cape Cod, and if you look there, you see those windows. So this is it's a beautiful view of the bay, but when I bought the house, it didn't have very nice windows. There's some birds there right now, you can see at the feeders. So I didn't have much money at the time, and I needed to build some windows, and they cost, I think, $2,000 a piece. So the ACLS invited me to give the Phi Beta Kappa lectures, and they said they would pay me $2,000 for each lecture, and they asked me how many I wanted to give. And I said, I want to give 1, 2, 3, 4. I want to give 8. So they put me on to give lectures in 8 different places, for which they paid me $2,000 each one, and that's how I put the windows into this house. But I gave the first one with my draft of what I thought I knew about theory and the approach to the study of mythology. And there was a discussion. They were good places too. I wrote down where they were. They were good places. I think I started at Amherst or someplace like that. And there were people in the audience who knew more than I did about theory. And they said, look here, you haven't thought this through. You're wrong about this. And I took lots of notes, this and that and this and that. Then I went upstairs to my hotel room and I rewrote that lecture. And then I gave it the second place in an improved form. And again, they said, look here, you've missed this, you've missed that. How can you say this? How can you say that? And I went upstairs and I rewrote it. And by the time I gave the 8th lecture, and I read stuff that they gave me to read in each place, um, I knew a little bit more about theory. And that was the book that I finally sent off to Columbia University Press, and that was published. So it was a really educational experience, and I owe it all to the 8 windows in my Cape Cod house.
oh, but you honestly can't write this. The implied spider with the 8 legs, and the legs are actually the windows.
I
And on
hadn't even
top,
thought of that.
and on top of that, if that wasn't enough, theory in many ways frames how we see the terrain. And so you wrote the theories by
Oh,
getting all these windows.
I got the legs into the frame. It's true. It's true. 8 legs. I never thought of that. They are
Hilarious.
indeed octopods, aren't they? So anyway, that's the story of that. So I learned a lot about theory.
So what? Obviously, you've got so much to choose from. Tell us some of the stories that like really get you going, really stay with you. That whether they're entire works or vignettes or characters. That say a bit about that.
I keep coming back to the Mahabharata. One of the last books, in fact, the last book I published, yes, the last book I published last summer, Ravi Singh published in India, um, was Unfaithful Wives and Faithful Dogs, stories from the Mahabharata. And I took those stories out of books 12 and 13 of the Mahabharata, which are the books of unbelievably boring discussions of Dharma, which nobody ever really even reads anymore, but you can cite it for your purposes. But in the course of don't do this, do that, don't do this, do that, it's taught to King Yudhishthira. Vyasa tells most of the stories and other people as well. Sometimes Yudhishthira said, well, why did that happen? And he says, I'm glad you asked me that. There's a story. Once upon a time, there was a king, and then he tells a story to illustrate the law. So I went through these incredibly boring Dharma texts, and I fished out like plums from a plum pudding, stories about women and animals. I guess stories about women and stories about animals have always been my favorite stories. And that's why the title is Unfaithful Wives and Faithful Dogs. Faithful Jackals, Unfaithful Wives and Faithful Jackals, because jackals are usually not faithful. Jackals are usually very nasty people, but there is a very good jackal in one of these stories. And so that's just a little book, but I had a lot of fun with it. So I've always been interested in stories about human beings and their relationship with the gods. And the Hindu gods are very human. The Hindu gods lose their tempers and fall in love and do a lot of things that the God of the Hebrew Bible never did. That's why I find Hinduism a more interesting religion than the one I grew up with. So I always found stories about women and about families and about marriages. And I was always interested in animals, in jackals and lions and dogs and horses. I was also interested in stories that were paradoxes, the stories that Levi-Strauss was talking about, the stories that tried to fit the square peg into the round hole and never did. So the story was told again and again, and each time you never did succeed in fitting the square peg into the round hole. So I was interested in those problematic stories where there was not a simple happy ending. Things didn't quite come right. One way to fix a story that didn't have a happy ending is to send everybody to heaven. You just couldn't fix it on earth. There are human problems where you couldn't win, and then you died and went to heaven. So that's a way of not really fixing the story. And I was interested in those stories that didn't quite work. And those are the ones that were told over and over again, because each time they didn't work, you tried a different way. So even in this last book that I published last year, I was dealing with stories about women, stories about horses, and stories that were about ethical and moral problems, which is why they were there in these two big volumes of the Mahabharata, which are about moral and ethical problems, otherwise known as Dharma. So that was a lifelong interest. And I've always loved stories about Shiva. I've always found him the most interesting god and the most plausible god. When I look, people are so surprised, my liberal friends, looking at what is happening in America today. They can't believe what is happening in America today. But if you believe that God is like Shiva, it's not at all surprising. It's amazing we've gotten away with it as long as we have until now. You have a God who is violent, who is irresponsible, who is does things one way one day and another way another day. Inconsistent is the word I'm looking for. A God who's violent and inconsistent and passionate and emotional. If you imagine that he's in charge of the world, well, then Trump is just like an angel compared to what human beings can be. And this is, as the Hindus tell us, the Kali Yuga. And there is always a Kali Yuga, when all the ethical plans and all the high hopes fall apart because people are not good enough to carry out the plans the way they should be carried out. And if that is not a good description of what is happening on the pages of the New York Times every day to day, I don't know what is. So if you believe in Shiva as a god, this is not surprising. It's
Yeah,
am it's amazing we got away with, I mean, I grew up in the 50s and 60s. It's amazing. That was the Krita Yuga. That was the golden age for America. It was not such a golden age for Black people, and it was not such a golden age for women. There were limits to the gold in that golden age. But compared to this, it was the Krita Yuga for many, many people. So yes, I think that Hinduism makes more sense than any religion I know. And I think that Shiva makes more sense than any god that I know. I think that's the way the world is.
that's um that's so fascinating. The through line in my mind is often when I'll teach on Shiva, depending on the context, of course. Um, I like presenting him as transformation rather than destruction, because, of course, in a cyclical universe, what else is destruction but giving rise to a new creation? And teaching him through the lens of transformation is captivating, but also I feel in my tissues that this is an utterly transformative time for. I mean, we're living through a colossal transformation of America, and of course, there will be something at the end of that that dance when the Damaru stops beating. Who knows what that is? But we're sort of watching it play out, and I think that's a beautiful metaphor and insight. And I think it's also apropos that who was your first love? Who did you dissertate on? Who's this erotic ascetic that captivated your interest? And here we are, one of your abiding loves, apparently. Um,
Erotic aesthetic. I never swerved. I was always faithful to him. Still do.
um, uh, you know, how do I phrase this? So clearly, there's been an enormous amount of learning, just as we all undergo as human beings, but learning in your case about life, about all things Indic, about the academy, and you know, another oceanic question. So forgive me, but could you share an additional couple of sort of nuggets of insights or ahas that has occurred since the time of those letters?
Huh. Well, India's changed and I've changed. Um, Question is what audience you're writing for. I was writing for my parents, which was pretty much writing for myself. I didn't have to censor. And in fact, I never did censor. Um, I was always writing for my father, to some extent for my mother, and I knew he was on my side. He was very smart. He was a publisher. He would get my jokes. He would catch my allusions. I didn't have to dumb anything down for him. At the same time, he would appreciate my jokes and he would appreciate whatever elegant turn of phrase I might manage, something of that sort. I wanted to show off a little bit. And he died when I was just 30. That was a terrible loss to me. He died of cancer. But I've always been writing for him. And I always taught my students to write for me the way I wrote for him. That is to say, to assume that you have an intelligent reader who's not out to get you, but is going to try to figure out. If you don't say something quite well enough, they'll figure it out anyway. And if you make a joke, they'll laugh. So that you have a friendly feeling toward your audience. Among other things, that makes it a great pleasure to write. And therefore, very few of my students have ever had writer's block. You can keep on writing. It's fun to write. You write and you say, they're going to love this. Well, they don't always love it. You make mistakes and you have hostile audiences. I know that. But you write it in the feeling that you're going to have an intelligent reader on your side. And that never changed. I mean, my father died long ago, but I always wrote for him. So I think that's an important part of teaching, important part of my teaching was to make, I graduated 85 PhD students in my career. And that doesn't count, 10 or 15 that fell by the wayside for one reason or another. But 85 made it through. And most of them got jobs, and some of them got really good jobs. Asha Sutter is my student, a very fine Indian writer. Laurie Patton is my student. She was president of Middlebury College and is now president of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. David White. I had some really wonderful students. And Jeffrey Kripal, lots of people. And that was, I taught them that. And they learned, they knew all sorts of things I never knew. They went their own ways. But I taught them to have that pleasure in writing where you trust the audience. Now, you know you're going to get critics who will misunderstand everything you say and critics who won't like you. After The Hindus was published, I actually had hostile readers too, who went out of their way not to understand anything I was saying. You know that everyone is not like my father, but you write for those who are. You always have some audience of intelligent people who want to like what you're writing. And then writing is a pleasure, and writing is successful, and you go on doing it. And you know you're going to get bad reviews. You know the world is the world. Um, but still, the hope with which you write is that some, if you're lucky, most of your readers will be intelligent and sympathetic. So that's was the great key to my training of doctoral students. David Schulman was my first and perhaps my greatest of all my students, who writes many very bold books and has friends as well as enemies. But he's a great scholar and a great human being. And that's why that was my first. I remember when I had David Schulman, this is going to be easy. He wrote this dissertation. He'd give me a chapter. He knew Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Russian, German, French, and Hebrew and Arabic. And he came to London to learn Tamil. Um, and then he wrote these chapters that were perfectly argued, perfectly. I thought, oh, my first of my 85 students. I thought, this is going to be easy having graduate students. You don't have to do anything but read the chapter and hand it back and say, this is great stuff. So they weren't all like that. But they were good, and they handed in their chapters and they wrote their books and they went off and got their jobs and their professorships and so forth. So that has been an important part of my life, has been training those students and indeed writing books in the spirit of believing that everyone was going to like them, even though I knew, of course, that people don't. But you don't need everybody to like what you're writing. You don't need everybody to understand what you write. You just need some people. There has to be somebody out there. It doesn't fall a stone dropping silently into a pond that is never heard. There is an audience out there. There are intelligent people and who want to know new things. And that confidence has fueled me and fueled my 85 PhD students over the years. What I wrote about changed over the years. There were I was always interested in women. I was always interested in animals. Still, I am interested in women and animals. I began at one point because I was at Chicago and I was on the Committee on Social Thought in Chicago, which is a very peculiar place. I realized that I was allowed not only to write about Sanskrit because I had a PhD, BA and MA and PhD and DPhil in Sanskrit. I was certified that I knew Sanskrit, but I was also able to write about Hollywood movies of the 40s and 50s because I happen to have seen just about every movie ever made in the 40s and the 50s. And I was able to write about animals because I'd always had dogs, and for most of my life I'd had horses. So that who I was as a person was also relevant to scholarship. And I taught that to my students. That would interest them might be what might interest their readers. That you didn't have to be a tabula rasa, this blank thing into which information came and information went out. So that was part of the fun I had in teaching and writing, and I think was part of my success as a teacher. I guess
Beautiful.
that's That
Yeah,
was it.
those are brilliant observations. Thank you for sharing. Again, I mean, a number of themes. I know a thing or two about being a doctoral advisor's first student, and I know a thing or two about being accused of ruining them. No, I tease, of course. But 85 doctoral students is no small accomplishment. As a matter of fact, if you do not write anything other than your first book, which was your dissertation for tenure, what have you, and you had a life of teaching and churning out 85 students, that would have been a very full career at the academy, along with admin, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's ginormous because it's far more than an intellectual investment, as it's
It's human.
as is evidenced from your stance and your commitment to that. And I feel in a certain sense we've come full circle, because I think what I'm surmising is that one of the aspects of your temperament, that render you able to sense the human behind the myth or the projected human or whatever it was. You see, your ability to connect with these individuals as people,
Mm.
irrespective of their talent, intellects, or their own, or their ideologies, or their theoretical affinities. It was all of that was the icing on the cake of seeing them as people, connecting them with people, cultivating them as people. And ironically, focusing on that gave them the courage and confidence to do good scholarship, where so many other situations, um, I've talked to dozens and dozens and hundreds of people through the podcast. Ironically, I'm technically independent. For now, I would welcome a professorship were the right fit, obviously. Yet, because of the podcast, I get to speak with a great number of our colleagues all over the place. And just through my own observations and our conversations, so much academic mentorship has to do with the pressures of intellectualism, has to do with churning out good work. And ironically, you're so focused on transmitting this anxiety about churning out good work, you create someone who has all kinds of anxieties about writing, or might be more prone to sparring, or maybe defensive. And I think we all, myself included, have fallen. But I can speak for myself. We've all been insecure grad students who had to improve ourselves for a variety of reasons.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
but I think that the brilliance of understanding something of the human heart, both in interpreting myth and the people behind the myth, the imagined people in front of the myth, but also the people that you were viewing and regarding first and foremost as people, that ironically cultivated brilliant scholarship. You see, this is the thing. Where did we lose the human touch in the humanities? I mean, isn't the human touch should it not be the cornerstone of the humanities? And so this is one observation that I see from what you're telling me.
I was lucky in many ways. I was lucky to be at the University of Chicago, which, first of all, had a very fine South Asia department, still has. So fine Indian students and students of India came there. Secondly, just by accident, which is too long a story, I ended up in the divinity school of all places. Me, this godless Jew, there I am teaching in what was at the time and still is one of the finest divinity schools. And thirdly, I was teaching, I had three appointments on the Committee on Social Thought with people like Saul Bellow and David Green, who were scholars in entirely different fields, who encouraged me to write about Shakespeare when I wrote about Sanskrit stories and so forth. So I had myself wonderful colleagues. I had Ramanujan, A.K. Ramanujan was my colleague, and Ed Dimmock, and Mircea Eliade was my colleague, and Paul Ricoeur. So I was in a wonderful place with really good people. Um, and they weren't just Sanskritists. Um, so that I had a very enriching set of conversations with my colleagues, which I would not have had any other place, I think, in the world. I also had 10 good years in Oxford with wonderful people there, with the anthropologist Mary Douglas, just just great people that I knew. So I was educated by my colleagues. I didn't just study Sanskrit with Ingalls and then go out into the cold world. My education continued as I was in the company of people in other fields who educated me in Shakespeare and in Homer and in anthropology and so forth. So I was lucky in that as well. So there was a lot of luck involved, and also the time when I was there. So
Yeah.
it was Kurta Yuga for a long time. It really was.
This is fascinating. I'm convinced that Mary Douglas, much later in her scholarly career, actually, I think a year or two before passing, wrote this fascinating work on ring composition. And it actually, I had these theories about the Devi Mahatmya and its structure, but it wasn't until encountering her work that I could sort of outsource the theorization to. I just cited her, I said, look at what she's saying at the ring composition. That's great. So I'll ask you maybe to.
She was one of my good friends. I was with her 2 weeks before she died. I was going to visit her in the following fall, and I wrote to her. It was May. I said, I think I'll come see you in October, and she said, come now. And I did, and she was indeed dying. I was with her when her husband died. So she was a really close friend over the years, and her work meant a great deal to me, as did her friendship. So that was just a piece of luck. Where will I go off hanging out with Mary Douglas? But I met her and we became friends, and she was an important influence on my life and on my work. So there was just a lot of luck involved, a lot of good luck.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing. I'll just maybe comment very briefly on one of the other sort of nuggets of wisdom that you mentioned earlier, and then I'll ask you maybe one final question before we close. Um, this, I love this mentality of focusing on an intelligent, resonant, charitable audience as your intended audience for your work. Because I'll have to say that there are all kinds of other demands on time, whether speaking or podcasting or you name it, teaching. But I think one of the reasons why there's this new translation of the Devi Mahatmya that's been sitting on my desk for 3 years um, is that although it's faithful, it takes certain liberties for the sake of English rhythm and pitch and cadence. And
Mhm.
I have, I think,
As
in the
thanks as much.
yes,
Perfectly.
but also we've got a number of antiquated translations, but we've got a rigorous translation in Coburn and David Azakali, and so this one is actually has a flavor for poetry and flavor in English, right?
Good.
Something to
Yes.
be more delicious on the tongue, and I think that it is the preemptive concern about the uncharitable grammar folks that I think that I need to get over and really imagine that resonant audience for who this is intended to serve ultimately.
Yeah.
And I think that was
The readers will find
really
you. Your work will find them. The ones who don't like it won't read it. They'll read something else. They'll read
fascinating.
Coburn.
um, So while we wind down and close for today, I would love for you to share maybe where you're at now, if there's anything you're currently working on or your process these days, and ultimately, really, anything at all that you wanted to touch on regarding this particular publication or its implications, or really anything at all about scholarship or your life, or that you might like to say before we close.
Well, I'm old now. I'm going to be 85 in the autumn, and I'm not well. I have a lot of problems that one gets with old age. I'm spending the summer alone in my house out here on Cape Cod with my dog, my wonderful dog. Um, and I think it may be my last summer in this house, for one thing, because I'm isolated and it's a little dangerous for me to be that at my age. And my memory is not as good as it was for texts. Um, so that I'm not really working, and my energy is not as I rest a lot. I rest a lot. So my energy level and my mental retention level is not as good as it would need to be to write a whole new book. And I must say that since I retired and COVID also came right afterwards, and I became ill, it all served to push me into vanaprastha, which is kind of where I've been. I don't keep up with the scholarship in the field anymore. I don't read a lot of academic books. I read poetry and I read novels and things of that sort. So I'm no longer, anyway, I published 40 books anyway. I'm not interested in writing another book of the academic kind anymore, even a translation. What I am writing now is a memoir. Um, Talking about some of the things we talked about together, you and I, today. Partly because I had such an interesting life, and partly because I I lived in a time of such privilege compared to what academics go through now. It really was a golden age when you could say whatever you liked and you didn't get thrown out for stepping on somebody's toe, and you didn't have to talk about gender, and you didn't have to talk about race, and you could just talk about what you were talking about. So it's a kind of a golden age, and I had a lot of fun in my life too. So what I'm working on now is a memoir. Um, I've got a rough draft of it, but there's a lot more to say. I showed a rough draft to Ravi Singh, who thinks he's interested in publishing it in India. Um, I've written in part about the fight I had with Penguin India and Modi and that whole crowd and so forth. That's not what it's mostly about, but it's about everything. So I'm kind of winding things up and putting them together in a way. Um, and trying to, while I still have a memory, I have a very irrational and irregular memory. I remember some things very well, but I don't remember where I put my glasses and things of that sort. I'm in that phase of old age, um, where I can recite all of a poem that I learned when I was 30, but did I have breakfast today and did I take my pills? So I'm dealing with an irregular memory and trying to get down on paper whatever the vivid things that break through the barriers of old age and exhaustion and forgetfulness to shine forth. So it's what I'm doing for fun. Um, some of my friends have read it and have liked it and said, say more about this, say more about that. My brother, who's also my lawyer, has said maybe say a little less about this and a little less about that. Um, so that's the project of the summer. It's about 120 pages now, and it's about half done, and I have lots and lots of notes. Sometimes I think of something, I quickly write it down before I forget it again. It's called A Good Forgettery. It's about all the things I forgot and the things I didn't forget. Um, so that's what I'm doing this summer. And I probably will have a draft at the end of the summer. The University of Chicago Press is looking at it, but I don't think they'll want it. We'll see. A lot of it is about Chicago and about my Chicago years. It was about, 45 years. It's a long time there. And it was also a golden age for Chicago. So we'll see. And I may leave out the bits that my brother thinks I should leave out. Very nice having a lawyer for a brother. So I'm having fun doing it, hanging out here in this beautiful place with the birds. I've just put out a new feeder I got for the Orioles, which is much better than the old feeder. So it's a place where they can come and sit down and eat. They like Concord grape jelly. So in case you ever want to feed an Oriole. So that's what I'm doing. I'm writing a memoir called A Good Forgettery. Um, and that's it.
Well, ironically, I think that'll be a book to be remembered. It sounds like a delightful and fascinating read, one that I'll certainly get my hands on just for my own interest. But certainly, if you are willing, we would be delighted to offer some publicity by covering it on the podcast. It sounds like something we would very much interested in covering, as you have to return for that. And in the interim, I want to thank you for appearing today and having such a far-reaching, thought-provoking, candid conversation that I found quite fulfilling in my capacity as podcast host, which is pretty much always the case. But I also found very fulfilling in my capacity as sort of a younger Jedi figuring out life and scholarship. And I really found much of the wisdom you shared quite useful in crystallizing my own burgeoning perspectives on life and scholarship. So thank you very much.
Delighted. I had a wonderful time. It was very nice having you ask me all these questions and pay such attention to me. I feel old and on the shelf. No one's really interested in me anymore. It's nice to know somebody is still interested in me. And it was just fun talking to you, I must say. I enjoyed it very much. So be curious to see what you get out of all these meanderings and put together in a show. I hope you'll send it to me when you finish editing it, and I look forward to hearing it.
Yes, absolutely. For those listening, of course, we have been speaking with Dr. Wendy Doniger, who is the Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor Emerita, now retired, from the University of Chicago, who has contributed voluminously to the field of Indian mythology and Indic studies more broadly. 40 books and 85 PhD students. I'm not sure that most of us could do either of those things, much less both in tandem with everything else. So have a look at An American Girl in India, which offers a unique peephole. But like all peepholes, there's so much more that it's saying without saying that may relate to you and your life and your relationship to all things Indic. Until next time, keep well, keep listening, keep reading, and keep contemplating conversations, conversations across scholarship and the life of practice, across East and West, across then and now. Take care.